can't wait to see what God is going to do through that, and excited to see how God might use some of you to jump in with that as well. Now, that being said, let's jump into what we're talking about today. I was thinking about this earlier this week. Do you ever notice some of like the crazy warning labels that you see on different products? Like I saw on an iron recently, a box for an iron like that you would use on your clothes. It said, "Do not iron clothes while wearing them." And I was like, "Are you serious? Like, why do you even need to say that? That feels like that should be just an understood thing." Or maybe there was another one I saw. It was for a flushable toilet brush, and it said on the box, "Do not use for personal hygiene." And I had to think, like, how do you even do that? Is somebody brushing their teeth with this thing? Are they like using it to wash their back? Like, what is going on? I don't understand it. It makes you wonder when you see these crazy warning labels, like, are these there because somebody actually tried to do this? Like, I saw a children's ministry, or not a children's ministry, a children's medicine one time. It said, "Do not drive a car or operate heavy machinery while using this product." And I want to know, like who's sending little Timmy out to drive the forklift right after he drank his little plastic shot glass of bubblegum flavored cough syrup? Like who's doing this stuff? Or maybe the worst one was this. I saw a curling iron that said, "For external use only." And I don't even want to know why that one's on there. I don't want to know. It's mind-blowing that such common sense things need to be codified with a warning label. But yet we also know that the truth is that without those warning labels, sometimes people in our society, they will try to exploit any lack of specificity that there is for personal gain. They see an opportunity to make a lawsuit, and a frivolous lawsuit that will, bring them some money. And people try to exploit that lack of specificity. Other times, it works in reverse. Instead of exploiting a lack of specificity in a rule or in a law, sometimes people will try to take a general law or a general rule and enforce it in particular ways that aren't explicitly spelled out in the law, but they do it, they like extend it to some pretty absurd lengths just to make themselves feel better in some way. For example, did you know that in the Middle Ages, animals could be tried in courts of law? Like, we have recorded court cases of horses and rats and pigs and even insects being taken to court. Matter of fact, in 16th century South France, there was an entire species of beetle that was taken to court for destroying some vineyards. And what's even crazier is the trial raged on for 8 months. I don't know how that happens, but this trial went on for 8 months. And we don't even know the final result because the court document, the last page of the official court documents where it would have said what the verdict was, appears to have been eaten by insects. I'm not even making that up. Like, it's a true story. It's crazy. But it makes you think, like a lawsuit like that, like what was the goal? What were they hoping? Like, these beetles couldn't repay anything. Like, they somehow wanted the beetles to be held responsible for destroying their vineyards, for destroying their crops. And so the people took these existing laws and they carried them out to ridiculous lengths just to kind of make themselves feel good. There was no good, there was nothing that was going to change because of this verdict. And that is the very definition of legalism. It's when you take existing rules or laws and you apply them to such a ridiculous extent that it doesn't actually produce any good or any goal. It just makes whoever is pursuing it feel a little better about themselves. And frankly, it's that type of legalism is what we see in the passage that we're going to be talking about today. If you got a Bible with you, go ahead and open up to Luke chapter 11 is where we're going to be. We're going to begin in verse 37. And while you're getting there, I want to kind of bring you up to speed. For the last several weeks, we've been going through this series called Walking with Jesus. And it's called Walking with Jesus because we're looking at what is called the travel narrative in the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke, unique to that Gospel over any of the other three, has this travel narrative. It stretches from chapter 9 to chapter 19, and it's really unique because it covers this portion of Jesus' life while he is traveling. He is on his way. He is literally walking to Jerusalem, the place where he's, when he arrives there, he's going to be arrested and crucified and rise from the dead again. Like, that's what he's headed toward. And along his journey there, Luke records tons and tons of his teaching. And a lot of the teaching of Jesus that is recorded in this section that we're going to be looking at, that we've been looking at throughout this series, it reveals, frankly, some really hard teaching, things that sometimes make us a little uncomfortable when we think of Jesus. Like, we want to think about Jesus as like healing people and helping the poor. But in this section, when Jesus is doing a lot of teaching as they're traveling, he says some really tough things. He reveals the depth of commitment that followers of his are making when we choose to follow Jesus. When I say that, I'm not talking about when you're first learning about him and just kind of testing things out and you're not really sure. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the type of follower of Jesus who has said, you know what, I am sold out. Yes, Jesus, I will give you my whole life. See, this series, Walking with Jesus, is about what that looks like. And it's filled, like I said, of really challenging stuff. Like the first week, we talked about how, being a follower of Jesus means that we're going to go wherever and whenever he asks us. And we talked about some other difficult things through the series up till now. And today, we're going to be talking about legalism. Legalism, it's something that Jesus encountered quite a few times in his life, including the passage that we're looking at today. And it's something, frankly, that's so easy. It's so easy for it to crop up in the life of a Christian who is genuinely trying to follow Jesus. That so often in our lives, as we're genuinely trying to live our lives for God, we find this thing of legalism popping up in our lives where we didn't expect it, we didn't even necessarily invite it, but it shows up. And so as we look at this passage, as we go through it, we're going to discover three questions that I think, if we will just ask ourselves these questions regularly and honestly, that these questions will maybe prevent us from falling into legalism, or maybe it'll alert us when we come across things that expose that we maybe already have fallen into legalism. So Luke chapter 11, beginning in verse 37, we're just going to jump right in. This is what it says. It says, when Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Now, the Pharisees, if you're familiar, they were this class of religious Jewish leaders who were known for being extremely pious, really dedicated followers of God. They were often seen as community leaders in the places where they lived. And to be honest, Jesus' teaching, the things that Jesus taught throughout his life, more closely resemble the teaching of the Pharisees than they do to any other Jewish group at the time. Now, there's going to be some obvious differences. Some of that we'll talk about today. But to be honest, beliefs-wise, they weren't that far apart. But the thing with the Pharisees is they took their zeal to be devoted to what God asked them to do. They took it to some unhealthy extremes. See, Jewish law, if you're familiar with this, Jewish law contains 613 laws that God commanded the people to do in the Old Testament. And the Pharisees, they just basically wanted to make sure that no one ever broke those. And so they took those 613 laws and they added about 1,500 more laws to it, other rules, and then they really dogmatically enforced them on the Jewish people, kind of forced them on them. They called it the fence around the law, is that there's these 613 laws that God says we're not supposed to break, so we don't want anybody to do that, so we're going to make up all these other laws that will make sure you don't ever get close to breaking one of those 613 really important laws. And so they make all these rules that they expect everyone to follow. Now, it's interesting that Jesus, up in his ministry up until this point, he's actually spent quite a lot of time around the Pharisees. Maybe if you remember a while back in June, we talked about a passage in Luke chapter 7 where we see Jesus having a meal at a Pharisee's house, and a woman comes in and anoints his feet. And it's during a meal that's very similar to the one that we're talking about today. But in the passage here, he's at another Pharisee's house for lunch. And this time, while he's there, he violates one of their rules. Not one of the laws of God, but one of their extra rules that they had tacked on. See, one rule that they had like forced other Jewish people to do was that they said that all Jewish people were supposed to do this really elaborate hand-washing ritual before meals. And the reason is that they were to wash off, like symbolically wash away the dirt that they had come in contact with throughout the day as they went about their business out in this sinful world. And so specifically, they were supposed to wash their hands and do it so that the fingers were facing down and the water would drip off of them, because they were so afraid that if they washed their hands like this, that the sin would just drip right down their arms and into their clothing. Like, it was kind of a ridiculous thing, but it was really symbolic of like, this is how committed we are to living for God. At least that's what it was supposed to be. And so Jesus shows up for lunch. He doesn't do this hand-washing ritual. And it says that the Pharisee that invited him was surprised. Literally, the Greek word for surprised there means that he was extraordinarily disturbed. Like, he's watching Jesus not do this, and it bothers him, like, deeply. Remember, Jesus has not broken God's law, but he's broken their extra rules. It goes on, verse 39. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness." Nobody has said anything yet, but Jesus just addresses the elephant in the room. Basically, I know you all saw me not wash my hands, and so he addresses this elephant, and he does it in a really offensive way, pretty rude way, to be honest. He says, "Look, external cleansing of something without internal cleansing is pointless. Just like when you wash a dish. You don't wash the outside and leave the inside all nasty. Like, you wash the inside. That's the important part." And so what Jesus is pointing out to the Pharisees there is he's basically saying, look, when you observe particular religious behaviors like washing, this hand-washing ritual that you wanted me to do, when you focus so much on those without addressing internal sins that are going on in your life, it's pointless. That faith, it comes from the inside out. It's not an outside-in type of thing. It begins on the inside and then is revealed on the outside. Jesus goes on, verse 40. "You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." See, their whole concern up to this point had been cleanliness. Not worried about dirt, but they're worried about ritual cleanliness. It's a type of cleanliness that would prevent them from worshiping at the temple. Now, it's important to point out, like, people in that time, under the Jewish system, they could become ritually unclean for a lot of reasons. Matter of fact, most people were usually unclean in life. It was just part of normal life. There were certain things you did that kind of didn't separate you from God like sin does, but it made it so that you couldn't worship him at the temple in the way that these Pharisees really, really wanted to. And so that's why, because it was such a widespread thing, so common, that's why part of the reason that they had priests. It wasn't a sin to be unclean, but the Pharisees treated it like it was. And Jesus is basically saying to them, like, look, you Pharisees, not only are you unclean, you're downright sinful, you're greedy, and you're wicked. And so he tells them that being generous to the poor is a way that would demonstrate the internal change of heart that was needed to make, and that if they could do that it would make everything clean for them. Basically, look, devotion to God is demonstrated from the inside out. That this internal love and devotion to God would lead to external deeds of love and generosity. Now, I want to pause here for a minute and acknowledge something. Like this, all of this so far sounds pretty good. All of us in here, when we hear this, the idea that faith begins on the inside and comes out, we all want this to be true of ourselves. Like we would all acknowledge that this is a good thing, even if the reality of our lives is that we maybe practice a little differently. See, we all acknowledge that this is how it should work. And honestly, the Pharisees would agree with this too. Even if they were upset by Jesus' delivery here, they would understand, like, yeah, faith in God it begins internally and it shows up externally. See, everybody here agrees, at least on like an intellectual level. But yet Jesus, as we've seen, he's already exposed them for focusing too much on their exterior religious lives while neglecting their internal devotion to God. And so Jesus, he really gets ready to drive it home. And as he does, he's going to pronounce over the Pharisees that are there. He's going to pronounce over them a series of what are called woes. A woe is like a statement or a warning of divine judgment. Basically, Jesus is going to lay out some bullet points of like, hey, here's why you guys should really be worried about your standing with God. There's some things that you're doing. There's some ways that you're acting that are revealing the internal rot, the internal spiritual rot in your hearts. So he goes on in verse 42, he gives that first woe. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. So he talks about something that honestly wasn't a bad thing. Like that the Pharisees were so meticulous about making sure that they tithed, that they were generous toward God, that they gave what was required to the temple. And they did it not just with their income, but they did it with, some of their agriculture and the things that they had in their lives. And so that's not that Jesus is saying, hey, that's a bad thing that you do that. He's not condemning their rule keeping, but he highlights how pointless it kind of is that they're doing that because of the things that they're neglecting. See, they thought that their faith was proved through their keeping of the law plus their extra rules. But Jesus says, look, what you really need to do is to focus on justice and to focus on love for God. That sounds an awful lot like the greatest commandment that Jesus had taught earlier. That greatest commandment, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. That justice is how we love our neighbor, and love for God is what moves us to that love of our neighbor. See, essentially right here, Jesus has just revealed the bottom line, the foundational principle behind these woes that he's about to declare over the Pharisees. And his message to them at that time is the same as his message to us today, and it's this: that the depth and the genuineness of your faith is measured in relationships. I'll say it again, the depth and genuineness of your faith is measured in relationships. It's measured in your relationship with God, and it's measured in your relationships with others. Now, to be honest, the Pharisees, they would have heard that and they would have admitted, like, yeah, that's really important. They would understand that. But then in their practical lives, in everyday life, they would turn around and crush other people with the weight of the expectations and the rule following that God had never asked his people to do in the first place. They would have this empty observance of all these rules along with the unloving way in which they required everyone else to do the same thing. And it revealed that their relationships were deficient. They were all rules, no personal behavior, and no growing together in love. Now, we're hearing this. Everybody, like, internally, you're nodding right now. Like right now, you're nodding because you recognize this legalism that is shown in the Pharisees because you've experienced in life. We've all had people who have treated us in ways that made us feel unloved because in their eyes, we didn't measure up to some standard that they had imposed on us, but that maybe God had never actually required of us. See, legalism, it's so easy for us to spot in other people. It's so easy for us to see when someone is being legalistic towards us or toward another person. It's easy to see in others. but it's really hard to see in the mirror. It's really hard to see in ourselves. See, most people, when they come and they study this passage, they do it through a lens of, okay, God, you're going to give me some principles that are going to help me identify legalism in other people so that I can protect myself from them. And I can really understand in life whose opinion really matters. And that's an okay way to come at that passage. Like, maybe that's even an important thing to be able to identify that. But it's also kind of dangerous. See, the danger is that we become Pharisees ourselves by thinking that the problem is all out there, that it's all with these other people who are legalists. We're not, but they are. And so as we move through the rest of these woes, I want you to listen for yourself. And as we go, I want you to ask these 3 questions that we're going to kind of draw out of Jesus' words as we go. So we're going to continue. Verse 43. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. See, the Pharisees, their religious performance was all about attention. In modern day terms, we would say it was all about clout or clicks. It was all about getting people's eyes on them. They wanted to be seen. And Jesus says, look, if that's your attitude, man, woe to you. It's really similar to Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, where he says this, Matthew 6:2. He says, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. He says, look, if that's your motivation, you've already received your motivation, your reward in full. That attention that you receive, that attention that you've been seeking, that's the only reward you're going to get. Because when you do that, you're not investing in a relationship with God or with people. It's all about what you can get from them. You become takers. And so Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, look, you are takers. He goes on, verse 44. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves which people walk over without knowing it. Contact with the dead was one of the big Jewish no-nos. It was one of those things that made people unclean. And so if the Pharisees were so focused on cleanliness, they should want people to avoid these graves. But Jesus is saying, look, he's using a metaphor. He's saying, look, when people interact with you, when people listen to you, it's just like they're walking over this unmarked grave. They don't even realize that it's hurting them. They don't even realize that it's causing them to not be able to be in as close a relationship with God as they would like to be. Ironically, it's the opposite of what the Pharisees claim to want to do. That they put this fence around the law as a way to protect people and to try to help them have a closer relationship with God, and yet the way they enforced it and the dogmatism that they put around it, it led them to actually harming people's relationship with God. Now, this is like a brutal critique from Jesus. It's really tough. And it's so brutal that one of the Pharisees sitting around the table, he feels the need at this point to differentiate himself from the rest of the Pharisees a little bit. This is getting really heavy. This is really serious. I'm not completely with them, Jesus. And so he basically speaks up and says, hey, don't lump us all together. We're not all like them. And specifically the one who did this, it says that he was an expert in the law. Now, experts in the law were all Pharisees, but not every Pharisee was an expert in the law. The experts in the law were like the upper echelon of the Pharisees. They were the ones who really, really dug into Jewish tradition and the Jewish scriptures. They were the ones that taught most fervently about these different rules and putting them into place. They were the ones who came up with the teaching that all the rest of the Pharisees followed. And so this one speaks up and he's like, hey, don't lump me in with them. Jesus goes on and addresses him in verse 46. Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves would not lift one finger to help them. He says, look, you place all those unnecessary expectations on people that they can't live up to you, but you don't help them. Which leads us to the first question that you should ask yourself regularly and honestly is this question: am I helping you get there? Am I helping you get there? Here's what I mean by that. When you see something in another person's life that trips your radar of like, this is not good, this is not right. Maybe they're headed down a path of sin, or they're headed down a direction that like maybe they're not in sin yet, but it's a direction that you know is going to be dangerous and it's going to be difficult. Am I helping you get there? That ideal that you're trying to call them towards instead, are you helping them get there? Are you willing not just to point it out, but to actually help them overcome it? Maybe another way to phrase it is this: am I willing to be there for you tomorrow? Am I willing to drive you to that appointment? Am I willing to continue to pray with you? Am I willing to build you up? Am I willing to walk with you through this? Or do I just want to make my displeasure known and then never have to interact with you again? Maybe you could voice it like this. Are you giving them a destination without giving them directions? Like, you understand how pointless that would be, right? Like if you said, you need to go to New York City, and you told somebody you need to go to New York City, but they have no idea how to get there, and you're like, yep, go for it. You understand how unhelpful that would be? Right? Like that's essentially what we do sometimes to people is we say, you know what, this isn't right in your life, you need to fix it, but then we're not willing to walk with them, walk alongside them to actually help them take those steps. So your willingness to continue to show up in somebody's life, not to condemn them, but to support them, it reveals the depth and the quality of your faith. See, when all you bring to a relationship is criticism, whether that criticism is warranted or not, you reveal that relationship is all about you. That you're focused on expressing your feelings, getting things off your chest. And often it reveals the rot in your soul that have resulted from years of focusing on rules. And frankly, even in those cases, we usually only focus on the rules that we want to focus on. We convince ourselves that we're focused on responding to the good news of Jesus when, in fact, we're missing it. Jesus exposes this same dynamic in the Pharisees. Look at verse 47. It says, "Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs." That might sound a little bit weird to us, and so we got to get a little bit of context. In the Old Testament, there was a series of prophets that God sent to the people of Israel, and their job in their time, they delivered a message of God's judgment on the people because of their sin. That the people of God had been sinning some heinous things, and so God sent prophets to say, you need to turn back to God or else he's going to bring destruction on you. And their message was not welcomed. Like, it wasn't received like, oh, thank you so much for letting us know. Like, they were received with anger, and frankly, they were killed. That these prophets would come and they would deliver this message, and the people didn't want to hear it, and so they would imprison them, they would beat them, they would kill them. And now, a couple hundred years later, the Pharisees are saying that they want to honor these prophets by building them special tombs. They want to set up memorials to them, which seems like a good idea, but Jesus is pointing out here that it's actually more empty performance. It's not honoring a prophet when you publicly praise them and then ignore their message. You aren't somehow better than your ancestors. As a matter of fact, you're rejecting these prophets too. The Pharisees, their mouths honored the prophets, but their hearts did not, because they still lived contrary to their message. Jesus tells them, look, this is a pattern that's going to continue. Look at verse 50. It says, "Therefore this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that have been shed since the beginning of the world." Just like their ancestors had rejected the prophets, Jesus is saying, look, this is a pattern and it's going to continue because you're going to reject me and you're going to reject the apostles. They honored the prophets, but they rejected their message. They publicly honored Jesus, but they're going to reject him and they're going to persecute his followers. They declare their love and admiration, but their lives are not changed. That brings us to that second question that we need to ask ourselves. Is my life different because of Jesus? Is my life different because of Jesus? Has your relationship with Jesus led you to life change, or are you just like everybody else? Does your life after knowing Jesus look the same as it did before, with the exception of maybe you come to church every once in a while and you tell people, yeah, I love Jesus, but your behavior, though, you don't make effort to live according to his laws, that there are things that he says are the best way for you to live, and you know that, and yet you make no effort, you have no interest in it. You've got to be careful here. See, not all religious life change is good. There were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were really devoted to God, but not in good and healthy ways. Does your life change reflect a deep love for both God and for people that are made in his image, which is everyone? See, these are really common inconsistencies that we even see in our own lives today. For example, do you oppose abortion because every baby is made in the image of God, while you dishonor and devalue other image bearers by consuming them like a product through pornography? Do you condemn someone's substance addiction while you neglect the importance of the relationships in your life because you're addicted to your phone? Are you quick to serve in ways that will be seen? I want to go to Loaves and Fishes. I want to go serve at YAPAC. I'm going to volunteer in the kids ministry. I'm going to do all these things at church. And yet internally, you turn up your nose at those who do less than you do. While at the same time, your prayer life, your relationship with Jesus is a desert. Before I trumpet my own devotion, before you trumpet your own devotion, we need to ask, is my life different because of Jesus? Pharisees, they held themselves up as models, but their faith was empty. Just like their predecessors, they claimed to be better than their predecessors, but they struggled with the same thing. Jesus goes on, he finishes the woes with a real dagger. Verse 52, woe to you experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. It's really offensive. The Pharisees, they prided themselves on their knowledge and their ability to bring that knowledge to others in a way that will help them in their relationship with God. At least that's what they said. They said, look at my life. Let me show you how it's done. But Jesus is basically saying back to them right here, like, hey, you're not who you think you are. You are the blind leading the blind. You're hurting more than you're helping, which is, honestly, it's a tough message for anybody to hear, which leads us to the third question that we need to ask ourselves. This is a question that will both reveal and combat the buildup of legalism in our hearts. And the question is this: do I evaluate critique? Do I evaluate critique? How do you respond when someone points out your shortcomings? When somebody points out your blind spots, and maybe even when somebody points out your sin? Because how you respond to that critique reveals something about you. The Pharisees did not respond well. Jesus has just touched on the most embarrassing and hard to admit faults in their lives. And how do they respond? Look at verse 53. When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. They get defensive, they get angry, and they retaliate. Do you? When someone comes to you with a critique, with a criticism, what's your go-to response? Do you get defensive and angry and you retaliate, or do you genuinely evaluate their critique? If you're brave, if you're like really brave, you won't just ask this question, do I evaluate critique? You won't just ask that question to yourself. You'll ask that question to the people closest to you. Ask your spouse. Ask your kids. ask your coworkers, ask your close friends. And don't only listen to the words that they give in response. Watch their body language. Are they visibly uncomfortable while they're answering that question? Do they give a nice answer, but they look just unsettled as they do it? That's a red flag. See, our tendency is to broad brush the critiques that we receive, especially if it's delivered in a rude way. It's like we think that the packaging negates the content, that if somebody says it in a rude way, I don't have to pay attention to the content of what they said. I can just dismiss it. See, the Pharisees, they refused to really evaluate themselves. That Jesus had brought this critique, and he did it in a way that they thought was incredibly offensive. And so they just dismissed it. They deluded themselves into thinking that they were the standard and that people not like them were less. And Jesus said that they would be held responsible for that. And you don't want to be. Yeah, now I'm not saying that you should just blindly accept all critique. I'm not saying that. Like something isn't true just because somebody says it. So you do need to consider the source, and you need to consider the truthfulness of it. Like generally, I would say you shouldn't probably give a ton of weight to criticism that is coming from somebody that you wouldn't ask for advice in life. But it also doesn't mean that criticism coming from those places is entirely off base. Take the time to really evaluate critique, because we know this. We said it before. The depth and the genuineness of your faith is measured in relationships. It's measured in your relationship with God, and it's measured in your relationship with others. Your ability to lean into those relationships, especially when you're in situations to either give or receive criticism, that is a key to developing a deeper trust in God. See, faith is all about trust. Faith is all about trusting that God's way really is best. That love for Jesus is the foundation that must come before everything else in life. Faith is trusting that our relationships with other people really do affect our relationship with God, for better or for worse. And faith is trusting that doing the hard work of relationships, both with God and with others, is worth it. Don't miss what Jesus told the Pharisees very early on in this discussion, because I promise you they missed it. See, that they would have received this thing that he said is like this blistering list of way off base criticism that doesn't actually apply to them, and what a rude guy for saying this. And yet they missed the message that Jesus had embedded in there from the very beginning. They missed the message of life that Jesus was offering. Look back at verse 41. What does he say to them? He says, but now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. See, so often we tend to think of God as like this cosmic taskmaster, that he just has this list of do all of these things for me or else. And if we aren't careful, if that's the way we view God, we are going to miss the freedom that is found in you. He was offering to the Pharisees, look, there is a way where everything can be clean for you, and it's through me, and it's through the way you relate to me and in the way you relate to the people in this world, the people in your life. He is for you, which means his critique of you is good. And the life change that he calls you to is for your good. And just like he calls you to walk with others as they become more like him, he will walk with you too. He doesn't sling condemnation all over the place just to watch you flounder and suffer. He doesn't just throw guilt on you to say you are failing and you are only a failure and you'll only ever be a failure. But he offers his own spirit to come and live inside of you and to guide you into the life he has for you. So submit to him. We're going to sing a song as we wrap up this morning. And as we do, I want to encourage you to really ask those questions of yourself. Maybe right now while we're sitting here and you just need to have a moment with you and God is that as you evaluate yourself and you run through those 3 questions, that maybe his Holy Spirit reveals to you an area of your life where you're like, man, I've been pretty legalistic here. That I haven't been focused on the good of others, or maybe I've been so focused on like my external activity that I've neglected my love and my relationship with God, or maybe I felt like because I have a relationship with God, it's made me impervious to any criticism that anybody could bring against me. Maybe you found yourself in one of those places, and as we sing this last song, it's an opportunity for you to say, God, I'm so sorry. I don't want to be this way. Would you work? Would you change me? And then go home and have those tough conversations. And to begin to view the world through the lens of the gospel. Let's pray together. Father, we love you so much. We thank you for Jesus more than anything else. We thank you that even in those moments in life where we discover something ugly or unsavory about ourselves that was buried deep on the inside that we didn't know about, or maybe we didn't want to admit for so long, and yet when you bring it to the surface, God, help us to rejoice in that. And that sounds weird, but help us to be thankful that you have exposed that so we can walk more in the freedom that you have for us, that the life you have called us to lead, the way you have called us to live is truly for our best and for the best of those around us. So God, help our faith to grow, help our trust to grow, help our love for you and for the people around us to grow. We love you. Thank you for your grace, your forgiveness. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.